Chapter 4. Apostles of the Alternate Hypothesis. The next morning, as I made my way towards the grand foyer of the Ministry of Inferences, Senate House Building, Mallet Street, primary sample space, I passed a crowd of official protesters who were waving placards and shouting passionately about more rights and inclusion for the ambidextrous nodes. Why should there be only left-handed or the right-handed nodes having all the opportunities? They shouted, "Be proud to be ambidextrous. The ambidextrous have rights too. And not just rights for the left-handed and right-handed on either side of the normalized distribution tail." As they protested, their voice shrieking with emotion, this was their only outlet against the restrictive, totalitarian, statistical, utopian state that controlled their every intention and consumption. They could not protest against the utopian state itself or the confidence interval quotas. Yet this was their one small outlet. They were officially allowed to protest for trivial social rights. So trivial, it was even amusing to the elevated alpha nodes who resided permanently upon the upper floors of the Ministry of Interferences and other ministry departments. As I sat in my office at the Department of Applied Statistics and Confidence Interval Inferences, I began to read Pareidolia's blog, which was posted on an underground dark web forum dedicated to the alternate hypothesis, which was in opposition to the utopian state's apodictic, null hypotheses of the Economic Efficiency Act. Pareidolia's thesis: State Utopia's economic efficiency. Null hypothesis leads to a perpetual diminishment of the node's utility. I hunched over my desk with my shirt sleeves rolled up whilst I started to become engrossed in reading this. I focused sternly as if I was appalled with what I was about to read. To appease the ever-present state's sentience, the cameras and scanners which always was processing my expected routines and emotions at each instance, to infer my probable thoughts and intentions towards the normalized utopia of the state, and it expected quotas. The perpetual monitoring, always present, always observing, constantly analyzing our implied thoughts. Perhaps the emotional scanners could even sense my heated forehead as an indication of my frontal cortex's emotions, which would imply that I was outraged. To the expectations of the monitoring algorithms that required this reaction from a loyal beta ministry node, soon to possibly be promoted into the alpha caste. Yet, unbeknownst to the algorithms, cameras, and scanners, I was focusing my outraged emotions, which I subtly struggled to subdue after the most probable demise of Mrs. White after she received her invitation to Arcadia. As I read through this thesis, I generated a pseudo-outraged expression, ironically mimicking the corresponding emotion which I felt internally about Mrs. White. This allowed me to mask the emotions from the emotions and implied thought scanner. I could mask my disgruntled emotions against the utopian state's confidence interval cull whilst reading this subversive thesis, where I was expected to feel such outraged emotions. In Pareidolia's defense, I respected his courage in rebelling against his nurtured, non-stochastic caste, which had immersed him within the state utopia's apodictic null hypothesis. Yet he had blossomed into a stochastic subversive follower of apophenia and the alternate hypothesis. It felt uniquely liberating to momentarily empathize with Pareidolia's perspective, which I was conditioned to never do. But now perhaps some tiny latent speck of random free will had emanated from within my animal spirit, which not even decades of state conditioning could factor out of me completely. Pareidolia's thesis read, "The economic efficiency of the null hypothesis, with its constrained normalization in the form of state-controlled confidence intervals, produced a statistical, totalitarian ideology, yet was just a sample set of the null hypothesis union and its supposed Eastern rivals of Zhou Pingjun. Yet together, they are merely economic trading partners, which have a global control over the world's resources. They perpetuate their global stranglehold by accepting each other as convenient enemies, even professing to hate each other, yet they both continue to trade with each other." This dichotomy of global power was born out of competing for natural resources, maximizing their individual market shares, ultimately spreading globalization, which now envelops the world completely. Bringing together a single unified, statistically augmented economy, guided by the ruthless statistical economic efficiency policies which are taught in all universities. The Economic Efficiency Act is now more of a negative thought externality to our societies. Its processes enslaves the nodes for life within a mundane, minimum wage, unfulfilling employment, whilst the alpha live in luxury without the need to toil in the fields or factories. This illusion is perpetuated by both sides of the null hypothesis union and the Zhou Pingjun. Both profess to be ideologically different, yet there is no real difference, whilst they propagate their propaganda to their respective worker nodes, that their null hypothesis and unique economic ideologies are the righteous side, and the other alternate hypothesis is the culprit. But it is a lie to solely reject the other's null hypotheses. As both sides have the same capitalist economic efficiency policies, both states would compromise their laws and ethics to keep control of their nodes. Each side is equally prepared to enslave their own nodes, to feed their economic efficient society that consumes nodes and states alike with an unbiased ruthlessness, whilst perpetuating the idea that the other side is morally corrupt, stated Pareidolia's written thesis. I knew this as I see into the randomness of the societal ether. I see into the nodes. I see into their patterns, their meaning. I see in their faces, whether in person or upon the CCTV screens. I see their facades, which they present to the state as obedient, endogenous sigma nodes. I see their expected emotions, yet I see their eyes. Their eyes cannot hide their intrinsic nature, their subconsciousness that cannot be tamed or dampened. There is an intangible glimmer of the animal spirit, an intangible glimmer of the irrational, where the eyes of truth are always watching. No amount of lies or conditioning can corrode away completely this glimmer, this spark of consciousness or subconsciousness. Yes, it can be rationalized away by the obedient node's conditioned psyche, but somewhere deep down the nodes surely feel or know instinctively the unnatural containment of their artificial statistical society. Their eyes lead to their hearts, which I can feel through the randomness of the oneness of the universe. I see their pain and unhappiness. They continue to process within the non-stochastic, harmonized normalization of their society, wearing their expected facial expressions, feeling expected emotions, ultimately adhering to merely process their existence and lives within the statistical algorithm's expectations, to always be obedient to their individual expected routines, which collectively is the process, the great beta function. A process that was supposed to augment and nurture the nodes, yet ultimately it controls and corrodes them to merely serve. I caught a lift down underground, to the nth floor, where the offices officially did not exist. In reality, they were just a series of large, dark nooks and crannies of open-plan rooms filled with countless computers and huge, wall-mounted monitors. Their screens subdivided into many CCTV camera views around primary sample space. A few large, wall-mounted monitors presented dynamic graphs, their contemporaneous data shifting and morphing continuously, representing the hidden national confidence interval quota. Each computer terminal had a civil servant observing and analyzing individual nodes of interest whose recorded movements on CCTV were transformed into statistical data, testing the nodes' levels of societal and statistical conformity. I walked through the general analysis area, proceeding deeper into another large, dark, open plan room, which housed a similar assortment of computer hardware and large, all-mounted monitors. But this room was dedicated to apprehending only the most serious of outliers. I was handed a metal safety deposit box which was securely locked. A nameless, expressionless security node, wearing glasses which contained a camera, recording everything he saw to deter him from ever observing anything that was in any of the boxes. He took me to a secure room where I could sit alone and open the box. A separate security node approached me with an equally detached expression and handed me a small metal key to unlock the box. Upon the locked metal box were handwritten ink words in bold capitals. Utterly confidential. Apophenia. 16/8/2048. I sat down as the door closed behind, then I heard the noise of it locking as I sat in the secure metal viewing room. I tentatively opened the box, which contained, as I exacted, a transcript written on the antiquated medium of paper. This transcript, which was apparently recorded by an undercover agent of State Utopia, was far too dangerous to be held as a file on a computer database, in case it may be hacked. I was secretly curious as to what was written on this piece of worn, handwritten paper. But I was equally honored to be given the clearance by the ministry to open this utterly confidential box and read its contents. The ministry must trust me. It had nurtured me and would soon perhaps promote me into the alphaship. Therefore they must be confident of my loyalty and my impeccable discretion. I started to read the transcript from the node the ministry referred to as Apophenia, one of the most wanted dissidents of the state, yet considered a spiritual leader by his followers. Pareidolia used the number 84 to signify the belief held by a small, growing group of subversive called stochastics that a prophet called Apophenia was preaching that the end of ridged statistical control within State Utopia would begin in 2084 this year. Pareidolia was loosely categorized by the state as a follower of Apophenia. Apophenia's real name was not known and did not even have a personal security identity number. He was not official, an exogenous node, nor a redundant node. He was some irrational term, some emanation of the countless small regression functions creating this statistical analogy. A sigma far in excess of any normalized or categorized sub-4 standard deviations. It's as if he emanated from far outside of the confidence interval, far within the +A2 of the z-value, of the murky, intangible, statistically significant, not allowed statistical ether. Within the realm of spirituality, a term considered a residual term, never used only when it was used immediately before the word superstition in old propaganda videos. Only a handful of nodes within the utopian state did not officially have a security identity or name. He had been given the code name Apophenia by State Utopia, which viewed religion as a form of apophenia. Apophenia's followers also adopted the name and referred to their prophet as Apophenia. Apophenia preached against society's heavy reliance on technology, which he referred to as techism, and warned against the spiritual dangers of societies being strictly controlled by soulless, statistical algorithms. Apophenia's location was classified as uncertain, but somewhere within a dynamic, normalized distribution, within his own separate probability wave function, around the mean of the Cornish coastal hinterland area, roaming chaotically whilst preaching his subversive spiritual teachings. Mainly within caves by the sea, where his stochastics followers were known to congregate and process their functions, in the fractal curves of the near infinite coastline, hoping to find a glimpse of the spiritual ether via his preaching. This is the written transcript of Agent X. I finally found the entrance to the hidden cave, which was nestled on a small, secluded beach behind a series of low, undulating, grassy hills in the Cornish coastal hinterland. I was stopped by two burly stochastics, followers of Apophenia. They asked me what I wanted. I replied with the expected correct response: salvation from statistics. The burly stochastics looked at each other, then ushered me in. I entered a shallow bell graph-shaped entrance to a large, dark cave, littered with naturally occurring crystal-encrusted stalactites, hanging from above and below, like statistical graphs, frozen, incarnate, from both directions, averaging their difference points out at each inflection point of random stalactite points. Nature's own cathedral filled with a small congregation of stochastics followers, free spirits and disgruntled, redundant nodes, all standing around Apophenia, listening to him answer questions. Apophenia stood on the alternate cave wall, wearing his white robes, looking like a religious leader, whilst he spoke of statistical freedom and intrinsic goodness. So many countless subversive statements and concepts were spoken by the congregation and Apophenia, too much for this one report, but all comments and intentions were firmly against the state's null hypothesis of statistical conformity. I had just enough paper to write this transcript of Apophenia, wrote Agent X. Apophenia had started his sermon with one word: choices. He had then continued: the state is too rational, too statistical, too systematic, too ruthless. Nodes are only given certain options to choose from. They are trapped in a proverbial mouse utopia of their neighborhoods and workplaces, all controlled by the statistical state. The state only cares about one thing, and that is efficiency, maintaining its Economic Efficiency Act quotas. Always the cold, rational payoff. The payoff given is the one with the greatest economic efficiency, creating a perception that the state always provides with aid of the superior, cooperative, dominant strategy. A cooperative nirvana where the nodes are safe. Safe from hunger, safe from extremes, safe from the irrational, safe from themselves. But it is our nature, our individuality, our animal spirit, our irrationality, to love, to dream, to share kindness from our hearts. Altruism. It is illegal to give beggars credits. It is illegal to show kindness where it is not appropriate, where the rules and laws and quotas say, no, you must not, under threat of punishment. I learnt years ago about the confidence interval and how the state is perpetually pigeonholing the nodes into their little sigma cast slots, their little routines of existence. But where is the option for altruism? Where is the option for the irrational moment, a moment of individuality, a moment of kindness, the option to self-sacrifice, to offer a disproportionate payoff, completely irrationally, against the grain of society, where the intangible, the animal spirit lives, the altruism, the irrational, even the madness and the genius. I am no expert on statistics, but the confidence interval is symmetrical in its distribution. Therefore, there is a negative region as well. Yes. Maybe that negative region of a normalized distribution quota is not good. Perhaps it contains the opposite of altruism, the opposite of kindness, residing within the negative region, harboring perhaps a negative externality such as madness, which is not to be encouraged. But perhaps madness spawns genius, maybe adversity spawns character. All I know is that the animal spirit and altruism would reside within the +A2 outside of the official normalized confidence interval sigma, residing outside of regulated choices and routines demanded by the state. Outside in the statically significant sigma variance, within the intangible realm of above the +1.96 or even +2.045 standard deviations, outside of the confidence interval within the murky, unpredictable, chaotic realm of the unrealized probability, relative to the state's restrictions on thinking and routines. Outside the confidence interval lies the intangible goodness. Maybe extreme evil resides on the negative side of the confidence interval, -A2. But I am certain a form of evil rules deep within any confidence interval where only restricted choices are allowed. The spirit, animal spirit, altruism, synergy. They all exist outside of the confidence interval, within the intangible. In a statistically controlled society, the average, the given, known, mean, and its normalized distribution is the only thing that counts. Where the nodes are forced to conform to a mechanical, emotionless, strategic way of thinking and routines, there is no place for extremes. Therefore, no place for the intangible, no place for the animal spirit, no place for good or even evil. There is no place for the good spirit in the regression models of an unnaturally forced, non-organically evolving society. The good spirit is intangible, only existing outside of the confidence interval where the node's true intrinsic, irrational nature and the spirit exist. Our minds are mere decision machines. All they do is make choices based on perceptions and calculations of their sample data presented to them by the utopian state. When the utopian state restricts our choices, they are restricting our individuality, our very souls. The spirit can jump and spread from variables. It is independent of correlations. It cannot be controlled, be manipulated, or die. The spirit is the cornerstone of all thinking, like a frequency or ether in the atmosphere, permeating throughout everything, soaking into all thinking and leading the way to intentions which lead to thoughts, words, and actions. But be careful of the negative frequency. The nodes make the subconscious choices, whether to accept the spirit at each decision process. Their thoughts and actions are a direct indication as to their intentions, what they think about, and what spirit is at the root of their thoughts. Just by reverse deduction you can conclusively see if you are thinking with a tainted bad intention. The negative spirit will make a node rationalize, to be angry, to justify wrongdoing. This will lead the node to carry out a perceived righteous harm. A node with the good spirit in them, however, will have love and good intentions within them. Their binary decision structure of thoughts and options will lead to a good thoughts and good choices. The spirit supersedes all the node's variables and attributes. It is the connection to God. Rules, superstitions, code, conduct, protocols, mystics are all irrelevant. Only the spirit is needed. It permeates through all thinking and is higher than the combined might of all the state servers and infrastructure contained within. Tune your spiritual frequency to find the good spirit, but remember there are different frequencies, bad and good. Just open your heart and you will find the good spirit, preached Apophenia. Apophenia continued, I have meditated within these caves, trying to find a reason, an answer to all of these situations and the existence of this restricted totalitarian state. Then one day, out of the thoughts, out of the statistical ether, like a 7 sigma event, I saw an infinite chain of numbers and symbols. Then one stood out. The plus sign, the great plus sign. Then I knew immediately what it signified. The greatest religion, the greatest faith that has been banned for decades, that now is only mentioned once in a blue moon, in cryptic mumblings. Now I see the connection between spirituality and of the antithesis of the cold, rigid, fixed utopian state engineered to be devoid of any spirituality or connection to the statistically significant great plus sign that resides far outside of the plus A2 confidence interval, far beyond the 4 standard deviations sigma, the great plus sign. Agent X had written, "Please refer to the other piece of paper." I looked in the box, but I could not find any other piece of paper. My hand frantically fumbled in the dark processes of the box as I now desired to know more of this great plus sign. But unfortunately, I could not find any more paper. Perhaps that precious piece of antiquated medium lay imprisoned anonymously within one of the other safety deposit boxes in the vault. Yet, unfortunately, I did not have the lays or permission to open the other boxes. As I put away the paper back into the box, I considered the fact that I was aware of finance principles, such as there was no positive net present value in financial instruments and of the strong markets hypothesis. These principles eliminated arbitrage opportunities or free, easy profits. Before the great statistical revolution, before the implantation of the economic efficiency policy, when profiting from the financial markets was encouraged and legal, financial traders performed technical analysis, trying to find any return anomalies or some profitable trends. They had faith that there were some arbitrage opportunities within the markets, even though they had been taught that there were no recognizable non-stochastic patterns, autocorrelations, or predictable trends, merely random walks. When religion was legal, religious nodes also had faith, even though there was no rationale to their belief. However, some traders did consistently make profitable returns. So maybe Apophenia was correct. Perhaps altruism was where economics met spirituality. I called the guard. He came and collected the box, double-checking that all the paperwork was in it. I realized that was a very profound, deep truth that I had just read, and that the state hid these extreme thoughts and variables to protect itself. I then remembered seeing all the countless other boxes in the safety deposit box vault. There were countless other boxes, perhaps filled half with lies and half with truths, or perhaps only filled with truths. I suppose it is rational that a totalitarian state hides the truths and propagates its lies. The correct result, or truth, can damage the state's statistical quotas. Driven society filled with biased lies of the given known mean, constructed by a statistical bias foundation which was too flimsy to prevent damage from the truth. Whilst the lies need to be continually propagated by the state, the truth only needs one fleeting glimpse to do its damage and to resonate within the observing nodes, indefinitely changing and corroding their contrived assumptions of the state's null hypothesis. The countless boxes all contained possible truths, possible treasures, just like Apophenia's great sermon, the life-changing sermon, that could turn the nodes against the state by waking them up from their sleep-induced statistical conformity. Each box a possible truth, a truthful mean, correct mean, an unbiased mean, not a given mean, but just being, just existing, within the murky ethereal probability cloud of the unknown, not known until the box is opened and analyzed. The hidden mean, a mean that is true and unbiased, unplanned and most probably inconvenient to the state and the observer, but a truthful mean of the data, of the situation, of the reality, that its distribution wraps around itself, around a true, unbiased, unknown probability of an event or circumstance. But the state needs to hide such truths, such inconvenient probability realizations as to protect itself in the great beta of constant, predictable returns, smoothed out variances and dividend streams with consistent marginal growth. So the state hides, restricts, and locks away every truth, every unbiased mean, every classical statistic realization with a biased, skewered, contrived, selection biased of its own official given no mean substitution. The data and nodes must wrap themselves around the given known mean of the self-fulfilling prophecy of the state's guiding hand, the current monthly state quotas and personal confidence interval expected sigma distribution realizations of the great mean. To think rationally, think mean, to choose the most ruthless choice, the highest payoff at every given event. The collection of hidden means locked away in their boxes, all collectively together forming one great mean, one hidden mean that emanated in this letter transcript being read. Perhaps the greatest truth lay in this box. Or perhaps it lay within one of the other safety deposit boxes. Perhaps the greatest truth regarded the statistically significant, mysterious, great plus sign. Possibly the greatest truth of all the hidden means contained within the locked, hidden boxes. A deterministic incarnation by the all-pervasive probability ether wave functions, resonating and culminating far in excess of the constrained vault walls, pulling me in towards it. So I, a recently disillusioned ministry analyst with a minuscule of potential power, would be privy to the great truth. As if the very fabric of the universe, reality and probability, had conspired to bring me here today, to this heavily secured, isolated, monitored room, to read the truth, which was now set free, within me, within my very observance and inference. Or perhaps I am seeing patterns that are not there, merely a superstitious observer acting within the random chance of life. Perhaps I am becoming an Apophenia too. But from now on, I will no longer think in fixed known means, rather fixed unknown means. I felt the unknown. Fixed mean. Enter my body, my mind, my thinking. No longer my psyche governed by a stagnant fixed known mean of the statically states quota-driven ideology. No now. A slightly freer node, able to accept that there was a true mean, a truth at each instance, in the probabilistic, ethereal reality. Elle realized that I would have to work to find each mean, each distribution, that there was no given, known, mean, only an unknown, fixed mean. I felt a little freer and more confident with my new frame of mind, which I hid from my emotions and frontal cortex. I remained as stale and clam as possible to the expectations of the scanners after this significant experience, where I had just read such a subversive paper as Apophenia's. "They caught pareidolia," shouted Bernoulli excitedly over the encrypted satellite communications. "Great. Take him to the Information Agenticity Agency building," said Blue. I felt a sudden shudder of terror at the thought of the Information Agenticity Agency's methods of extracting information. It was on a different level to the more moderately sadistic methods of the Ministry of Inference. The Utopia state, even with its all-encompassing malevolence, had an air of fair play, a marginalized, auto-regressive, distributed, lagged remnant of their past empire. But the predators at the Information Agenticity Agency were from a different state. They had less restrictive limits on their treatment of interrogated nodes, which they meted out to any perceived enemies of their state, domestic or foreign. They might even fly the poor pareidolia on a rendition to some non-null hypothesis union state for a more extreme inquisition. A stranger's voice was heard over the communications channel. It must be one of the officers, barking orders at him in a domineering, patronizing manner, as the now apprehended suspect was treated as guilty from the onset. In a state where nodes are terminated just for being a few shades of violet from the norm on their E-graph, a perceived, persistently successful political agitator was worthless, less than nothing, a negative variable to the overzealous and psychopathic officers who were now all present in every state. Pareidolia took a deep breath as the hood was whisked away from his head. The small, stuffy, claustrophobic integration room air seemed like the sweetest flesh air that he had ever breathed, compared to the suffocating old sack that had been used as a hood for the last few hours. The dimly lit rooms seemed as big as St. Paul's Cathedral compared to the confinement of the smelly old hood. He sat there, focusing on breathing in as much oxygen-rich air as possible to let his body make up for the lack of it for the last few hours. "Good evening, pareidolia," said one of the integrators. "Did you enjoy your rest?" asked another. Pareidolia concentrated on breathing whilst his head and torso bent forward. He started at the desk that he careened towards. It sheltered him from the bright spotlight that shone onto his now hunched silhouette. One patronizing guard shouted, "Wakey! Wakey!" I watched the scene unfolding, even though I was not an official integrator, but had been allowed to witness the interrogation, because I had helped apprehend him. Pareidolia raised his head slowly as he grimaced. He tried to peer over the incessant glare of the high-powered lights which bleached his silhouette, making him appear almost in an all-white resplendence, befittingly white, that of a saint or deity, radiating the reflected light into the rest of the dim room. "I am not pareidolia," he replied. "You have the wrong node. We have all your online and embedded data. There is no sense trying to lie this time," continued Delta 2. "Lie?" replied pareidolia. "The whole economically efficient utopian state is built on layer upon layer of lies." Delta 1 slapped him, saying, "The utopian state nurtured and fed you, treasonous variable. Yes, you were privileged to receive a beta-level education, then you betrayed the state's guiding hand that nurtured you," continued Delta 1. "The state is not free or fair. It traps the nodes in a fixed, given, no contrived mean corrupted further with its corresponding standard deviations, which we are forced to exist in. It discriminates against the lesser sigma caste, who have a lesser normalized utility to exist in, forced to reside closer to the repugnant negative Z values, perpetually constrained near the subpar, lower standard deviations, bordering on just being outside of the confidence interval within the wretched tails of the -A2, condemned to an engineered lesser utility, to lesser prosperity, to a more menial existence whilst the alpha enjoy the fruits of the lesser sigma's labor," Pareidolia relied passionately. I found myself secretly stirring inside by his response. "The economically efficient state functions perfectly, but each node must follow their quota to allow the great iterations, calculations, and expected values to create perfect efficiency," reasoned Delta 2. He then gave Pareidolia another crack with a rubber baton. Pareidolia screamed out in pain. I began to sweat, as I was confident the situation would escalate into violence. The only uncertainty was how long would Pareidolia hold out for until his inevitable breakdown and submission to the state's integrators. Both the Delta Guards seemed the usual psychopathic integrators, predictably enjoying their professional, methodical beating of Pareidolia. There was even a statistically significant probability that Pareidolia may even be killed during this integration if he held out too long. His body would then most probably be thrown into the Information Agenticity Agency's incinerator on the basement floor of the pyramid. "You think you are both free individuals?" Pareidolia spewed out spittle into the lights whilst his blood dripped down the side of his mouth. "Of course we are free," shouted Delta 2, then cracked Pareidolia again with his rubber baton. Pareidolia let out a piercing scream. His body frantically moved, while his mind tried to deal with the shooting pain. He resembled some possessed creature whilst he screamed and mumbled some undecipherable, angry, frustrated words. However, it did not seem a scream for mercy, rather a scream of hatred, because the integrators were not showing him any respect. "Do you still think the state is imperfect?" shouted Delta 2, ready to strike Pareidolia again for insolence and for stubbornly holding on to his convictions. I began to shield his eyes, predicting another round of violence and sadism. Delta 2 was about to swing his rubber baton again at Pareidolia. But then, suddenly, like a quantum fluctuation apparition, a third node appeared from the shadows of the room that I had not noticed on the grainy commutations receptions. He had appeared from the shadows. His facial features resembled that of an officer, unlike the stocky heads of the integrators. He held back Delta 2's arm. Delta 2 turned around, momentary glaring at the third node with hatred for stopping his violence. But then his eyes glazed over in a submissive acceptance of the third node's authority. The third node was dressed in a dark trench coat. He almost resembled an alpha. Pareidolia looked at him with two half-closed, bruised eyes. He was looking now at a non-random face, yet seeing randomness through his bloodshot eyes within the dark interrogation room. This paradox, Pareidolia seeing randomness in a non-random shape, could signify his inevitable turning and capitulation to the utopian state. The third node offered him an e-cigarette, which he gladly took. even if it was just to stop the beating and emotional trauma for a moment, to feel like a respected as a full-ranked endogenous node once again. They both remained calm and silent whilst they took long, pleasurable drags on their e-cigarettes. The third node then questioned Pareidolia assertively. "Pareidolia, you can't deceive us. Are you not one of Apophenia's disciples? Are you not a derivative of the Apophenia? Pareidolia, that sees patterns in randomness, in particular, seeing faces and meaning within random shapes and even clouds. Do you not think in redundant randomness? Do you not merge you thinking with stochastic forms and any shapes, inferring some convoluted appearances that seduce you into thinking subversively, finding meaning outside of the official confidence intervals within the statistically significant stochastic thoughts, intentions, and routines? Just like Apophenia, who sees meaningful patterns of rebellion against the state, against the utopian ideals, against the great economically efficient, risk-free economy. Apophenia, the ultimate transgressor against this statistical harmonious bliss that rejects the non-stochastic. Subversive, who is against the great apodictic null hypothesis of the utopian state, inquired the third node, then paused and smiled, softening his voice to a calm, empathetic tone. Come now, it does not have to be this way. Are you familiar with game theory? He questioned. No, replied Pareidolia. Well, we have a classic prisoner's dilemma, game theory situation here. We have another one of your political agitator colleagues in another integration room, stated the third node. Pareidolia looked up at the third node, frantically examining his eyes, searching for some glimmer of a clue as to who he was referring to. Who was it they had in the other room? A loved one, perhaps Pareidolia, speculated. The third node predicated this response and smiled whilst continuing. The good news is, if neither of you refuses to confess, you will only get a small custodial sentence. However, if both of you confess, then both of you will get 10 years in prison. But the bad news is, if you do not confess but your co-conspirator does confess, then he will get only 1 year in prison, but you will get the death sentence, and vice versa. The third node paused to let the full gravity of the statement sink in. Therefore the dominant strategy is to? He asked Pareidolia patronizingly. Not confess, replied Pareidolia, confused under the pressure of the interrogation. Incorrect. In that case, you would both get 10 years in prison, answered the third node. It is better than a death sentence, replied Pareidolia. Yes, I suppose so. The third node laughed. I never thought of that additional perspective to this game theory decision matrix. The third node paused as if thinking deeply. He then leaned over and whispered into Pareidolia's ear. But not worse than you receiving the death sentence whilst your co-conspirator only receives 1 year. He stood up and walked towards the shadows nonchalantly. He gets rewarded for betraying you with a lighter sentence, continued the third node. The sentence cut through Pareidolia's bruised and bloodied head into his narcissistic ego. Some other conspirator getting one up on me, he thought. The dominant strategy is for both of you to confess in case the other betrays each other. You cannot trust anyone, not even your fellow righteous conspirators, concluded the third node. No, he would not betray me, replied Pareidolia. I hope you are right for your sake, replied the third node sarcastically. He will hold out for the cause. Perhaps he nobly will. But would you bet your life on it? Finished the third node, similar to a master salesman. Pareidolia thought for a moment with a look of concern. Concern for a possible death sentence, but also for the possible betrayal of the claimed captive comrade in another room. Pareidolia then looked up smiling and said, "I chose the dominant strategy. You are right, I can sit here all night and you can beat me to a pulp, whilst perhaps my fellow conspirator would yield to his violent interrogation before me. Then he would confess, and I would no longer have that option to confess. He would have won a lenient sentence, and I would be doomed to a death sentence." Pareidolia lowered his head, resigned to betrayal. The only rational choice to accept, once again being caught up in the limited choice spectrum of state utopia's statistical tyranny and restricted binary decision trees of personal utility. "Therefore, I confess to everything. I am guilty," he announced. "Guilty?" questioned the third node, his tone enticing a more specific confession. "Guilty of rejecting the state's null hypothesis, guilty of rejecting the confidence intervals and its fixed, no, mean," stated Pareidolia. He then thought for a moment, as if regretting being rash to confess straight away. His shrewd mind, finding perhaps some space to negotiate, some small freedom or benefit, for his betrayal that should not just be given up on a silver platter, even if there may be perhaps some loved one in an adjacent room. "I am prepared to soften my views. I am prepared to work alongside your information agenticity agency. I am prepared to change," stated Pareidolia solemnly. His demeanor became calm, as if he was 1,000,000 miles from the interrogation room while sitting completely still, resided to submitting to the non-stochastic, imagination-devoid state. Yet strangely, Pareidolia was wearing an enigmatic, smug expression, perhaps at the prospect of still being valuable, still being important, still rising above his designated Sigma caste mean, before he was a subversive. But now he was a traitor, yet he still held an additional intrinsic value, allowing him to hover like an imaginary number above his birth-allocated real number line, Sigma caste. Pareidolia's ability to always be above his determined Sigma caste, no matter the outcome or situation, made him like a superconductor in a quantum superposition, always hovering above some electric field track, irrespective which side up he was. "No way!" exclaimed Delta II in disbelief and frustration. "Silence!" shouted the third node. "You are being prudent, Pareidolia," replied the third node calmly, even lovingly. Even I was shocked by the unpredictable rapidness of the events unfolding within the small integration room deep within the pyramid. "Can you turn that spotlight away from my eyes?" asked Pareidolia, looking directly at the third node, now accepting his submissive, dependent, endogenous Sigma position. The third node looked at Pareidolia for a few seconds, saying nothing, to remain in control. He then walked towards the light and repositioned its glare towards the floor. "I think we can work together," said the third node as he waved away the two integrators to leave the room. I continued to watch, transfixed by this interrogation, perplexed at how the once mighty Pareidolia, who spent decades criticizing the utopian state, would turn so quickly. Pareidolia continued to stare up at the third node as if bonding with him and the utopian state, savoring a new relationship where he still had an advantage, an economic rent, a star status, high above his ordinary Sigma caste rating. high up in the imaginary plane. Quantum superposition of political intrigue and celebrity. I will work for you. I'm getting old and tired of being an aware outlier, always having to live outside of the confidence interval, always looking over my shoulder, or up to a possible spy satellite high above, never trusting anyone fully. The higher caste Gamma Sigma nodes of the who secretly consider themselves subversive liberals, whom I entertain with my preaching, will carry on, oblivious, within their comfortable lives, who once in a blue moon perhaps would indulge their curiosity in secretly meeting some famous outlier node who supported their trendy alternate hypotheses, said Pareidolia, resigned to his new caste as a professional traitor. I switched off the communications channel whilst Pareidolia and the third node continued to bond, chatting and smiling like old friends. Who was leading who? Did Pareidolia break due to rationalism? Or was he playing a game, stringing the third node along? Then it dawned on me, Pareidolia has no convictions. He is merely an attention seeker, going against the utopian state not because he truly believed in subversion, mainly because it made him feel special. It made him feel unique. It fueled his narcissistic personality with attention and importance. He was nothing more than a convenient contrarian. I suppose everyone wants to feel special and unique, especially within such a statistically constrained society as the utopian state. Especially a narcissist like Pareidolia. I concluded that the small integration room had been full of damaged personalities, psychopathic guards, and narcissistic dissidents. Even my hidden, unique, observing personality. What about the third node? What type of creature was he that would have let the guards beat Pareidolia to death 1 second, then laugh and have an e-cigarette with Pareidolia the next moment? After observing this, it fixed my view that Apophenia seemed more spiritual than political. He seemed to truly believe his teachings, to truly believe in his convictions, and I doubt that he would ever change his views or betray his followers, unlike Pareidolia. Apophenia was a real spiritual figure, a real apostle of the alternative hypothesis. Stochastic freedom, unrestricted aggregate demand, chaotic unpredictable free market efficiency, as well as freedom to embrace spirituality, the ultimate imaginary number plane. I started to feel concerned that such a seemingly moral and good node was considered such an enemy of the utopian state. After reading Apophenia's truths, coupled with most the probable demise of Mrs. White, and the reverberating epiphany of the unpleasantness of the state utopia's confidence interval reality, all these contributing factors were leading me to despise more and more my role at the Ministry of Inferences and my connection to the statistical totalitarianism. But I had been nurtured and conditioned from the cradle to be a specific type of beta node who dreamt of reaching alphaship. I was trapped within my caste, yet my thinking was changing. Perhaps I would just continue to mask my thoughts whilst cradling a secret hope for an ideological revolution within the utopian state. I had felt this earlier as I had left the vault. Now, I was concerned. What would happen to Apophenia? Had he been secretly arrested by a snatch squad? Or was he still preaching to his stochastics followers within one of the countless cave labyrinths along the Cornish coastline? Hopefully, Apophenia would be preaching his message of statistical freedom and of altruism, whilst remaining free of the sample space scanners which continually searched every face that walked past at each moment, in every sample space. For him, the most dangerous node. The utopian state's infrastructure's very own sentient paranoid, pareidolia, inferences.